The Great Depression represents the most severe economic crisis in American history. The stock market crash of October 1929 marked the beginning of a decade characterized by high unemployment, poverty, deflation, plunging farm incomes, and lost opportunities for economic growth. The human toll was staggering. Between 1929 and 1933, U.S. GDP fell around 30%, and the stock market lost almost 90% of its value. The unemployment rate reached its peak at 24.7% in 1933, representing approximately 15 million unemployed Americans. This figure excluded those working reduced hours or individuals ineligible for official unemployment benefits, meaning the actual impact was even more severe. By 1933, over 60% of Americans were categorized as poor by the federal government. 9 million savings accounts were wiped out between 1930 and 1933, and 273,000 families were evicted from their homes in 1932 alone. The geographic distribution of hardship was uneven but universally devastating. In Cleveland, the unemployment rate reached 50%. In Toledo, Ohio, it hit 80%. The crisis affected every sector of the economy, with construction, shipping, mining, logging, and agriculture suffering the most severe impacts. 1.2. The New Deal's limited success. When Franklin D. Roosevelt assumed the presidency in March 1933, he promised a New Deal for the American people and immediately implemented an active program of economic recovery. The first 100 days of his administration produced a wave of legislation establishing numerous federal agencies and programs, including the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, Works Progress Administration, and the National Recovery Administration. These programs created millions of jobs and provided critical relief to suffering Americans. The CCC provided jobs to unemployed youths while improving the environment. The TVA brought electricity to rural areas for the first time, and the WPA provided employment to thousands in construction and arts projects across the country. The government became an active partner with the American people in unprecedented ways. However, despite all the president's efforts and the courage of the American people, the Depression persisted until 1941. When America's involvement in the Second World War resulted in the drafting of young men into military service and the creation of millions of jobs in defense and war industries. The New Deal's limitations stemmed from several factors. Some New Deal programs may have actually hindered recovery. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 set up codes that discouraged price competition between firms, set minimum wages, and sometimes limited production. More fundamentally, the New Deal never achieved the scale of fiscal stimulus necessary to restore full employment. When state government budget deficits are included with federal deficits, the new spending programs initiated by the New Deal had little direct expansionary effect on the economy, as state deficits actually declined while the federal deficit rose. 1.3. The 1937-1938 recession, a setback. The economy's fragility became apparent when a second severe recession struck in 1937-1938. Production declined sharply, as did profits and employment, with unemployment jumping from 14.3% in 1937 to 19% in 1938. This downturn resulted partly from a Federal Reserve decision to greatly increase reserve requirements, prompted by fears of speculative excess, which caused the money supply to cease growing and actually fall again. Fiscal contraction and decreased inventory investment due to labor unrest also contributed to the downturn. Between 1929 and 1939, the American unemployment rate averaged 13.3%. This persistent unemployment represented not merely a statistical abstraction, but millions of individuals unable to find work, families unable to provide for themselves, and human potential wasted on massive scale. By 1939, despite 6 years of New Deal programs, the American economy had still not recovered to its 1929 level of output, and millions remained unemployed. It was against this backdrop of persistent economic stagnation that the outbreak of World War II in Europe in September 1939 would catalyze a transformation in American economic fortunes. 2. The transformation begins. Military mobilization and production, 1939 to 1941. 2.1. Initial steps toward rearmament. Although the United States initially maintained neutrality when war broke out in Europe, President Roosevelt and American policymakers recognized that the nation's security interests were threatened by Axis aggression. In January 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appealed to Congress for $300 million to be spent on procuring aircraft for the Army Air Corps, which at the time had approximately 1,700 aircraft in total. Congress authorized the procurement of 3,251 aircraft, marking the beginning of a military buildup that would accelerate dramatically over the coming years. The fall of France in June 1940 shocked American policymakers and intensified calls for military preparedness. In May 1940, President Roosevelt called for production of 185,000 aeroplanes, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping in 2 years. These ambitious targets were initially met with skepticism. Adolf Hitler was told by his advisors that this was American propaganda. In 1939, annual aircraft production for the U.S. military was less than 3,000 planes. 2.2. The economic effects of early defense spending. The economic effects of increased military spending began to manifest even before the United States entered the war. Defense spending rose from 1.4% of GDP in 1940 to over 37% in 1945. This dramatic increase in government spending provided the fiscal stimulus that the New Deal had never achieved. By December 1940, the U.S. rearmament program had boosted income and brought national income above the 1929 level for the first time, almost 25% above that level. The rise was steep and marked a turning point in the Depression's trajectory. The government extended significant financing to industries to expand production capacity. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, originally created for small businesses and homeowners in the Depression, now gave loans on favorable terms to expand industry for wartime production. The British and French demand for American military equipment stimulated domestic production. By 1940, the British had ordered $1.2 billion worth of aircraft, leading to some aircraft being designed and produced to meet European requirements, and then being adopted by the U.S., such as the North American P-51 Mustang. This foreign demand helped American manufacturers expand their operations, hire workers, and develop production techniques that would prove invaluable when the United States entered the war. 2.3. The multiplier effect in the pre-war period. Research has shown that the economic multiplier effect of military spending was strongest during this early mobilization period. Gordon and Kren found that from the start of 1939 through June 1942, the multiplier effect was 1.8 because the economy was still suffering from high unemployment and unused capacity. This means that each dollar of government spending generated $1.80 in total economic activity, a powerful stimulus effect possible only because of the economy's slack capacity. When U.S. manufacturing hit capacity in the latter half of 1941, the multiplier fell to 0.88, indicating that once full capacity was reached, military spending began to crowd out some private economic activity. However, by this point, the critical transformation had already occurred. The economy had transitioned from depression-level underemployment to full capacity utilization. Total War, the Arsenal of Democracy, 1941 to 1945. 3.1. Entry into World War II and total mobilization. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, ended American neutrality and initiated a total mobilization of the economy for war. Though stunned by the events of December 7th, Americans were also resolute. On December 8th, President Roosevelt asked for Congress to declare war against Japan, and the declaration passed with just one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, bringing America into a global conflict that would reshape every aspect of national life. President Roosevelt established an extensive bureaucracy to coordinate war production. Roosevelt created oversight agencies including the Office of Production Management, the War Production Board, and the Office of Price Administration and Supply Consumer. And he adapted other New Deal agencies, such as the National Labor Relations Board, for the war economy. These agencies ensured cooperation between labor and capital and directed resources to their most productive uses. 3.2. The scale of production, unprecedented industrial achievement. The scale of American industrial production during World War II defies easy comprehension. The transformation of the economy from Depression-era stagnation to the world's dominant industrial powerhouse occurred with remarkable speed. American industry produced almost two-thirds of all the Allied military equipment produced during the war: 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. Aircraft production exemplifies the extraordinary achievements of American wartime production. 6. The debate over war-induced recovery. 6.1. The orthodox view: war ended the Depression. The conventional interpretation holds that World War II ended the Great Depression by providing the massive fiscal stimulus that the New Deal had failed to deliver. At a macroeconomic scale, the war not only decisively ended the Great Depression, but created the conditions for productive post-war collaboration between the federal government, private enterprise, and organized labor. This view emphasizes that the scale of government spending during the war far exceeded anything attempted during the 1930s. The mobilization for war demonstrated that the economy had possessed unused capacity throughout the Depression years, and that sufficient demand could restore full employment. The war proved that Keynesian fiscal policy could work if implemented on a large enough scale. Proponents of this view note that unemployment fell to negligible levels, GDP more than doubled, and production reached unprecedented heights. The transformation occurred rapidly and comprehensively, affecting every sector of the economy and every region of the country. 6.2. Revisionist interpretations, costs and limitations. Some economists have challenged the orthodox interpretation, arguing that the war did not represent genuine economic recovery. According to economist Robert Higgs, when looking only at the supply of consumer goods, significant GDP growth only resumed in 1946. Higgs argues that wartime GDP figures are misleading because they count military production at artificially inflated values and ignore the fact that consumers were actually worse off during the war. Most estimates showed declines in real consumption spending, which means that consumers were worse off during the war and business investment fell during the war. Price controls, rationing, and the unavailability of consumer goods meant that Americans could not purchase many items they wanted despite having higher nominal incomes. The extensive price controls, rationing, and government control of production rendered data on GNP, consumption, investment, and the price level less meaningful. What does it mean that gasoline had a certain price when it was rationed and purchases were limited? What does it mean that new tires had a price when new tires were not produced for civilians? The multiplier estimates for wartime spending also complicate the picture. Barrow estimated that the multiplier for WW2 spending for the nation was around 0.6, suggesting that the war spending crowded out about 40 cents of private economic activity for every federal government dollar spent. More recent studies focus on effects at the county and state level, with Brunette finding a state-level multiplier of only 0.25 during the war and suggesting that the estimate for the national economy is only 0.3. These lower multiplier estimates suggest that much of the increase in measured GDP represented a transfer from civilian production to military production rather than a net increase in economic welfare. Americans sacrificed consumption and investment to produce military goods necessary for national survival. 6.3. Synthesis: recovery through transformation. A balanced assessment recognizes elements of truth in both interpretations.
The war did end mass unemployment and restore full utilization of productive capacity, achieving goals that had eluded policymakers throughout the 1930s. In this fundamental sense, the Depression ended. Millions of Americans who had been unable to find work for years were employed, and the economy operated at full capacity. However, this recovery came at considerable cost. Americans endured rationing, price controls, the unavailability of consumer goods, high taxes, and inflation that eroded purchasing power. Young men faced the trauma and danger of military service, and families experienced prolonged separations. Americans sacrificed heavily to win the war, while their allies sacrificed even more. The wartime economy was not a market economy, but a quasi-command economy in which government direction determined what was produced, how it was produced, and who received the output. Despite the sacrifices, many remember the war as prosperous relative to the Depression because everybody had a job and developed a sense of shared sacrifice to defeat the Axis. Moreover, the wartime mobilization created conditions for post-war prosperity. The U.S. emerged from the war not physically unscathed, but economically strengthened by wartime industrial expansion, which placed the United States at absolute and relative advantage over both its allies and its enemies. The nation possessed the world's largest and most productive industrial base, a technically skilled workforce, and vast accumulated savings that would fuel post-war consumption and investment. 7. Long-term consequences and legacies. 7.1. Post-war economic structure. The wartime experience fundamentally restructured the American economy and established patterns that would characterize the post-war era. The war created the conditions for productive post-war collaboration between the federal government, private enterprise, and organized labor, the parties whose tripartite collaboration helped engender continued economic growth after the war. The federal government emerged from the war with vastly expanded capabilities and responsibilities. The bureaucracies established to coordinate war production provided models for subsequent government involvement in the economy. The success of wartime planning encouraged the belief that government could and should play an active role in managing economic affairs. The military-industrial complex, a term later coined by President Eisenhower, had its origins in the wartime mobilization. Large corporations that had received the bulk of defense contracts maintained close relations with the Pentagon, and defense spending remained a significant component of the federal budget throughout the Cold War. 7.2. Technological advancement and innovation. The war accelerated technological development across multiple fields. Aviation technology advanced dramatically, with jet engines, improved aerodynamics, and enhanced materials developed under the pressure of wartime necessity. Radar technology, initially developed for military applications, would find numerous civilian uses in air traffic control, weather forecasting, and other fields. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, represented an unprecedented mobilization of scientific and engineering talent. Beyond its immediate military application, the project established the model for large-scale government-funded scientific research and development. Post-war applications of nuclear technology in power generation and medicine demonstrated how military research could yield civilian benefits. Medical advances accelerated during the war, including the mass production of penicillin, improvements in blood transfusion techniques, advances in surgical procedures for treating trauma, and developments in psychiatry for addressing combat-related mental health issues. These medical innovations saved countless lives both during and after the war. Computer technology emerged from wartime code-breaking efforts and ballistics calculations. The ENIAC, developed to calculate artillery firing tables, represented the first general-purpose electronic computer. This technology would revolutionize business, science, and daily life in subsequent decades. Lastly, let's discuss labor relations and social change. The war transformed labor relations in lasting ways. Union membership grew substantially during the war, and labor unions became firmly established in major industries. The tripartite cooperation between government, business, and labor during the war created precedents for collective bargaining and labor management relations that would shape the post-war economy. The experience of wartime employment changed expectations about work and income. Americans who had experienced prolonged unemployment during the Depression and then full employment during the war expected that post-war economic policy would maintain high levels of employment. The Employment Act of 1946 reflected this expectation, committing the federal government to promoting maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. Women's wartime industrial employment, though largely reversed after the war, had demonstrated capabilities that would be remembered when women returned to the workforce in larger numbers in subsequent decades. The experience of Rosie the Riveter challenged traditional assumptions about women's capabilities and appropriate roles. The war experience also contributed to social changes that would manifest more fully in later decades. African Americans who had served in the military or worked in defense industries became less willing to accept segregation and discrimination, contributing to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. 7.4. Global economic dominance. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of wartime mobilization was the establishment of American economic dominance globally. While European industrial capacity was devastated by the war, American industry emerged larger, more productive, and more technologically advanced than before. The United States possessed approximately 50% of the world's manufacturing capacity at war's end. This economic dominance translated into political influence through institutions established at the end of the war. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 established the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, institutions that reflected American economic power and promoted a liberal international economic order consistent with American interests. The Marshall Plan,